Wii Sports was a phenomenon, a game that almost single-handedly launched its console to uncontested victory in its generation. Nintendo Switch Sports is a minigame collection, which, according to Google Trends, only barely managed to attract more interest after its launch than it got from its announcements, and is actually currently, as I'm writing, a less popular search term than Wii Sports. In addition to that, it is scored by users on Metacritic a whole 2.5 points lower than Wii Sports. All this in spite of the fact that the two games are really quite similar, with Switch Sports actually being obviously better in some respects, like online play or the resolution of the game. So what happened? Why did Nintendo Switch Sports fall so firmly in Wii Sports' shadow? Today, my friends, we investigate how Wii Sports succeeded where Nintendo Switch Sports failed. Part 1. Face-Off. If we want to get to the bottom of the difference in the reception of these two games, then it only makes sense we compare the fundamental meat of them: the sports. Wii Sports has 5 sports, while Switch Sports has 6. So I think a fun way to go about this would be by putting pairings of analogous sports head-to-head, and see which game comes out on top more often. We'll start with the sports that appear in both games. Bowling v. Bowling. Fundamentally, both of these games are bowling. The biggest difference between these two games is that in Wii Sports you have to decide when to release the ball, while in Nintendo Switch Sports that's done automatically. In Wii Sports, this is actually an important part of the gameplay of bowling, since the timing of your release of the ball greatly affects how the spin you put on your ball ends up affecting its trajectory. In Switch Sports, of course, that whole element of the game is non-existent. Additionally, this is probably just a matter of personal preference, but I in general prefer Wii Sports controls and physics as compared to Nintendo Switch Sports. They just feel a bit more real to me. Nintendo Switch Sports does have its Battle Royale mode going for it, which is pretty cool. But honestly, sometimes that can just be annoying because it places so much emphasis on closing your first 3 frames specifically. Sometimes you just want to have the opportunity to make a comeback. Then there's of course Special Bowling, where you have to dodge various obstacles on the lane, which spices things up quite nicely. However, Wii Sports already did that in its training mode, so I can't really give Switch Sports unique credit for it. Overall, in Bowling v. Bowling, I give the point to Wii Sports. Tennis v. Tennis. Okay, I'll be honest, I'm not as much of an aficionado at tennis in either of these games as compared to bowling. That being said, I do have to judge between them, and while they are quite similar, I do think that Nintendo Switch Sports Tennis feels a bit more impactful, possibly due to the characters actually having arms. Additionally, I think Switch Sports feels considerably better to perform a serve in. So here, in my opinion, the point goes to Switch Sports. And I guess now we need to compare some sports that aren't identical, like Tennis v. Badminton. I figured these sports are so similar that I could reuse Wii Sports Tennis for the comparison. Ultimately, while these are both net games with rackets, the fundamental difference here, as far as I can tell, is that in tennis, it's a game of hitting with proper timing to get the ball where you want it. Whereas in badminton, you have more direct control over where the shuttlecock ends up based on the way you swing your controller. They're both kind of about mind games in the sense that you want to place the ball or shuttlecock in such a way that it'll be difficult for your opponent to react to. The main difference seems to be that badminton has a lower skill floor for you to be able to participate in those mind games than tennis does. Ultimately, this one really does come down to a matter of preference, but for me, I'll give the slight edge to badminton. That means so far we are at 1 point for Wii Sports and 2 for Switch Sports. Boxing v. Chambara. Now the combat sports face off, and this one's really not a contest. The fact of the matter here is that Chambara actually consistently works properly, whereas boxing does not. Point to Nintendo Switch Sports. Baseball v. Volleyball. Okay, this one's a bit of a stretch, but I'm pitting baseball and volleyball against each other as the two asymmetric multiplayer games. Though volleyball certainly feels less so, since the roles are switched between so much more frequently. Ultimately, baseball is a much simpler, more relaxed experience. Volleyball, on the other hand, is a hectic battle for survival from start to finish. It also features much more variety of gameplay between its roles. In baseball, you can pitch and bat, whereas in volleyball, you can bump, set, spike, serve, and block. Personally, I prefer the faster-paced, more varied volleyball experience, even if your teammate can completely let you down on occasion. Another point to Nintendo Switch Sports. Golf v. Soccer. Okay, now these two are the only sports left. Well, no, I don't really have anything else to link them together, honestly. This really is an apples to oranges comparison. Golf is an individual, slow-paced, cerebral challenge that's primarily man v nature. Soccer is a fast-paced, reaction time-dependent game of Rocket League on foot. What I will say is that Wii Sports Golf, I think, does a better job at delivering on the fundamental premise and conceit of these Nintendo motion-controlled sports games, which is creating a fun, reasonably close approximation to the sport in question and the motions involved within it in video game form. I mean, to put it in perspective, you don't even use your feet in the standard gameplay mode of soccer, or as most of the rest of the world knows it, football! Quite frankly, while soccer is certainly fun, it does sort of come off as a normal video game, with motion controls shoehorned into it, that would probably be more enjoyable if it just used buttons. And that is just about an impeachable offense for a Nintendo motion-controlled sports game to commit. This point goes to Wii Sports. Okay, so after pitting all of the sports against each other, we find that Wii Sports won 2 of the matchups, while Nintendo Switch Sports won 4. Wait a minute. How can that be? I thought this was supposed to be a video about how Wii Sports succeeds where Nintendo Switch Sports fails. But this would imply that Switch Sports is actually the better game. So if the sports are fine, then why was Nintendo Switch Sports not nearly as well received? Part 2. I want to see me in the game. So as it turns out, I might actually give Switch Sports a slight edge over Wii Sports insofar as the quality of the sports is concerned. But those statistics at the beginning of the video don't lie. There must be something that Wii Sports does that sets it apart from Switch Sports. Well, first impressions are important, and for many, this was one of their first impressions of Nintendo Switch Sports. I guess I'll go with this hair. I don't really like any of them in particular. Now, I'm not one of those people who refuse to give the new human designs in Nintendo Switch Sports a chance. Honestly, in certain respects, they're more visually appealing than Mii's, especially in the context of this game, where they are specifically designed to fit in with everything else. So again, I don't have a particular issue with them. But, did they really have to only give you 3 hairstyle options per gender upon booting up the game? Look, I know why they did this. They were, of course, holding back the other hairstyles so they could sprinkle them into you as unlockables. Unfortunately, in so doing, they ruined a large part of the charm of the whole Wii series, which was the fact that they starred these fun little caricatures of yourself, your friends, celebrities, fictional characters. I mean, seriously, half of the fun of Wii Sports Tennis was playing as Lord Voldemort. In Nintendo Switch Sports, they don't even have a bald option, let alone a snake nose. And seriously, the closest I've unlocked to bald in this game right now is this balding haircut, which, quite frankly, makes you look like some slimy senator, more so than the Dark Lord. Now, you can play as a Mii in Nintendo Switch Sports, but then a good deal of the unlockables are useless to you. And quite frankly, they just kind of look out of place in the Switch Sports world. And also, I'm not even sure most Switch owners know there's a Mii creator on the Switch. So ultimately, I recognize that Nintendo was in a tough spot here. They wanted something to reward the player with to keep them playing, and cosmetics seemed like a good option. But they came at the expense of personal expression in the early game. I wasn't playing as Mii when I booted up Nintendo Switch Sports. I was playing as a stock Switch Sports human. Perhaps if they had been a bit more generous with especially the hairstyles you started with, I wouldn't have had this issue. Perhaps they could have gotten by motivating players to play just for the sake of improving their ranking. You younger players may not realize this, but back in the day, people used to play online games just because it was fun to play them, not because we were trying to unlock our next loot box. I mean, I played tons of Mario Kart Wii Online back in the day, just for the thrill of competition. I went through a phase recently where I played a bunch of online chess, just to try to build my elo. Point being, loot boxes, which is essentially what Nintendo Switch Sports has, while ubiquitous these days, are not a necessary design element for a multiplayer game. I mean, Wii Sports didn't have them. We just played those sports because they were fun. Those were the days. Part 3. What's new is old again. But ultimately, I don't think loot boxes and character customization is responsible for a 2.5 point difference in Metacritic user score. No, I think it's something far more fundamental. A law of the universe itself. Time. Wii Sports was a revolution when it released. I mean, heck, the Wii was initially supposed to be called the Nintendo Revolution. Motion controls like this were more or less completely foreign to the average gamer. While it might be a bit silly to think about today, back in 2006, these cute little renditions of sports populated by these big-headed creatures was probably one of the most immersive games of all time. Now, over a decade and a half later, we've seen Wii Sports and its resort and its club, and all manner of motion-controlled minigame collections on the Wii. We've Wii played, we've Wii partied, we've Wii musicked, we've connected, moved, and just danced, and quite frankly, a collection of 6 competently put-together motion-controlled sports is not nearly as exciting today as it would have been back in 2006. And added on top of that, it really doesn't help Nintendo Switch Sports' case that a lot of its sports are things we've seen before, often from Nintendo themselves. Bowling and tennis are just straight up pulled from Wii Sports, and badminton is too similar to tennis, at least on the surface, to make much of an impact. Chambara is almost a direct lift from Wii Sports Resort, soccer is basically just Rocket League on foot, and volleyball, while probably the freshest of the sports present, is really mostly a series of motion-controlled QuickTime events when you really think about it. Oh, and just in general, 6 sports in 2022 is hardly exciting when Wii Sports Resort had 12 back in 2009. Wii Sports was a risk, a gamble, an innovation, and Nintendo Switch Sports just plays it safe at every opportunity. It's an interesting question as to whether you should judge a work of art in a vacuum or in the context of its release. On the one hand, judging in a vacuum will theoretically give you a more objective comparison of quality between works. But on the other hand, it misses some intangibles. Things like innovation and the technical possibility of the time period in which the work was made. Wii Sports was a great, innovative game that spawned many copycats. But in so doing, it created an environment where just doing Wii Sports again would be unimpressive, and perhaps disappointing. A successful formula unchanged will stagnate, and eventually fall out of relevance as others pass it by, and set new expectations that weren't present in the original work that was released. One day you're subverting tired old tropes, cutting a new path. The next, your subversion is the tired old trope, and by doing what was once bold and innovative, you seem tired, old, and cliché. It is an interesting question as to whether you should judge a work of art in a vacuum or in the context of its release. But the fact of the matter is, it's a question that really doesn't matter. The human mind doesn't work in a vacuum. We care far more about relative values than absolute ones, and while it may be an interesting debate to have, ultimately, by and large, people will always judge something in comparison to the time of its release, its predecessors, and its contemporaries. Conclusion. Nintendo Switch Sports is a good, motion-controlled sports game collection. It is competently put together and decent fun. Where it fails is in misjudging the expectations of the time of its release. If you swapped the release dates of Wii Sports and Nintendo Switch Sports, well, firstly, you'd have some very confusingly named games, but also, I think you'd be watching a video right now called How Nintendo Switch Sports Succeeds, where Wii Sports fails. And not unjustly either. It's reasonable and good that we give innovators and trailblazers extra credit when evaluating their work, because it's by those innovations that we push the boundaries of what's thought to be possible. Without a game like Wii Sports, we never see Nintendo Switch Sports, and that is to Wii Sports' credit, whether you like it or not. I'm reminded of a quote said by the Red Queen in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. Now here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. In a healthy, competitive industry, if you're not moving forward, you're falling behind. Wii Sports was a great leap forward that in so doing became a phenomenon. Nintendo Switch Sports loitered around the same place for 15 years, and then was surprised to find that the world was already far past that place where it stood. And that's the story of Wii Sports and Switch Sports. A tale of the passing of time and complacency. But anyways guys, I hope you enjoyed this analysis. Do consider subscribing and checking out my other videos, including one quite like this one, where I compare Kirby Star Allies to Kirby and the Forgotten Land, as well as my other game design analyses. I've also made a video where I rated all of the sports in Wii Sports, and I have a Let's Play of Nintendo Switch Sports on my Let's Play channel. So check those out if they intrigue you. But until next time, I have been CMeeCraft, and I'll catch you in the next video. Goodbye.